and welcome to Finextra. I'm Hannah Wallace and we're here at EBAday 2018 in Munich. Joining me now is Gareth Priest from Bottomline Technologies and we're talking about the changing payments landscape. Hello Gareth, how are you?
I'm well, how are you doing?
Very well, thank you. How are you enjoying the event so far?
Really enjoying it actually. The sessions have been really interesting, very thought-provoking and actually very honest. There's been a real kind of spirit of people digging in and looking at the opportunities and not perhaps in the past you might have seen technology providers or banks kind of holding their cards close to their chests. Very different feel to it this year.
Fantastic, well I'm glad you're enjoying it. Now, the changing payments landscape, how do you think banks are addressing these changes?
Well, I think a couple of things have happened. And we've heard some of that this morning actually. I think one of the things that banks are seeing and realising is that it's not a zero-sum game. That these changes, instant payments, open banking and API initiatives, whilst I think initially looked like a threat, have actually been deemed an opportunity to really grow the overall market and their share within it. So I've seen banks do a few different things quite differently perhaps than they have in the past. And if I were to put a theme to that, I'd say that they've become really collaborative. And a couple of examples, certainly ones that I've experienced anyway, that I think traditionally banks and particularly transaction banks were very focused on internal infrastructure, building their own things, having to own everything end to end. We're seeing banks now work a lot more with partners. Obviously we're one, there are others, and in particularly cloud partners, so that they can actually speed up innovation without having to do it all themselves. So I think that's one area that's of interest to the banks, and I think will actually help with this whole market rollout. The second area is in the area of innovation. One of the pieces that's become really interesting is that the payment unto itself, and it's funny we use the term transaction banking, the payment transaction itself has become important but less interesting. All of the things that sit around it, the added value if you like, are the things that have become very interesting to banks and also frankly to the users. So if it's a consumer, can I buy a card from you and pay you straight away and you can see the payment there? The pace of the payment is important, but what's more important is you get the information about it. And I think banks are looking about how do they collaborate with new entrants to provide some of those new features so they don't have to do it all themselves.
All right, and following on from that, what can we learn from the things that have gone on in the past for the UK?
I think the UK is a really interesting use case. It's sort of the canary in the coal mine to a certain extent. Faster payments was, we just heard in one of the sessions, Mexico was actually the first faster payment, but as far as Europe's concerned, the UK was first. And with the open banking initiative, that's gone a little earlier, perhaps than the full PSD2. So I think there's lessons that we can learn. Particularly as I think about faster payments, there was what they call the new access model, which was the regulators trying to open up that payments market to have more than just the traditional banks play in it. We had a ringside seat, Bottomline, as we launched an aggregator service, which essentially meant new access models for banks who perhaps didn't want to build it all themselves in-house. It was hugely successful. I think for us in the industry, 60% of the new entrants in the last 2 years came through the aggregation service. However, we had to work at the same time with the faster payment scheme and the Bank of England to recognise that this kind of technical innovation would help. Fortunately, they've responded very well. Bank of England have recognised Bottomline as an aggregator. But when I think about PSD2 and some of the other instant payments, I think the lesson would be that we need to line up the regulators, the schemes, the banks and their technology partners to ensure a smooth rollout.
And finally, what do you think banks can do to better secure their payments channels?
That's a really interesting topic that has been discussed at some length, I think, not just at this conference but others as well. I think the first thing is banks recognising, I think they already do, but really recognising that they have probably the prime role to play in this kind of payments landscape as the trusted provider. And I think part of that comes with some headaches and obligations, but also a huge amount of power and control, really. So I think banks are doing a few things around this. So number one, we're seeing banks, particularly successful banks, understanding that security in all of its cybersecurity, fraud and financial crimes are a feature of new banking innovation. They're not something that just sits on the edge or an add-on. They're actually something that has to be embedded in whatever we do going forwards. The second piece I think we're seeing is that, especially with an instant payment world where the window of transaction settlement is so small now, that the way that perhaps we used to do it as an industry of monitoring that transaction, well, there's no time to do that anymore. So actually they need to monitor upstream, who's initiated the payment, where's it come from, what are the precursor activities, and downstream, whether it's into the correspondent network or whether it's into the settlement scheme. And I think when banks do that, they position themselves to be the enabler of that whole payments ecosystem. And I think that goes back to my point of the way they do that is becoming expert collaborators.
Yeah. Well, fantastic, Gareth. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for watching.